Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to share 7 tips and tricks for crocheting. This is going to really help you if you are new to crocheting or if you like to crochet plushies. Sometimes things just don't turn out right and you can't really figure out what went wrong. We're going to address all of that today so everyone can improve their crochet skills. So stay tuned and comment below if you have a tip or trick or hack you want to share. And before we get started, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on any more crochet tips. Alright, so tip number 1 is ignore the recommended hook size on the yarn label. It doesn't matter what yarn you're using, they all have a recommendation on the back of it, and it's almost always wrong. This one says to use a 9mm crochet hook. When I crochet with this, that is not what I use. When you do that, it doesn't turn out right. There's a lot of holes, a lot of gaps in your crochet. And Big Twist Posh is almost the same size as the other yarn. And it said use 11mm. I clearly did not when I used that yarn to make this alien. I used a 6mm hook, so a lot smaller than what was recommended. So always go for a smaller hook. And that way there's no gaps in your stitches, there's no holes. And it's so important when you crochet plushies because, you know, if there's a hole, then a lot of times the stuffing comes out, the eyes don't fit in nicely. And this happened to me when I used the recommended hook size. You can see here there's a lot of gaps and holes in the stitches. But when I just use a smaller hook size than what's recommended, sometimes you try a few stitches, see if it looks nice, and then continue with it. It turns out really nicely. Because especially with Amigurumi and plushies, you don't want any holes to be showing. And tip number 2 is start with small patterns. Pick out a crochet plushie pattern where the finished plushie is going to fit in the palm of your hand. It's just nice when you can finish an entire plushie and see what you accomplish and see that you really can be successful at crocheting. If you pick a huge project, it could be really overwhelming. So that's why I like to start off with something really small, especially if you're a beginner and new to crochet, because it just feels so good when you finally finish a project. So there's a lot of patterns that are free and paid that fit right in the palm of your hand. And then it's a nice way to really practice your skills too without getting overwhelmed. Because there's some really cute plushies out there that are just huge. And if you're a beginner, that can just be so overwhelming. And it could take a long time to finish. And while you're crocheting, you just kind of start to wonder, am I really good at this? Should I finish it? Should I start something else? But it's really nice to just get it done and see how it turned out. So if you see a cute plushie like this one that's a little bit bigger, maybe start with a smaller one, see how they turn out, and then slowly work your way up to finishing bigger projects, and they'll just go so much more smoother and more enjoyable. Alright, and then tip number 3 is sew with acrylic yarn or sew with a plastic needle to avoid shedding or the yarn breaking. A lot of times it's not you, it's either the needle or the yarn. So either change out the needle or change out the yarn you're using to sew. I find that a lot of times with the metal needle, it kind of breaks the yarn more and it makes it shed more. So sometimes use a plastic needle if it's like chenille yarn. I know the plastic needles break. I've broken so many plastic needles. So that's kind of why I prefer the metal ones. But sometimes it's just nice when the yarn isn't making a huge mess and shedding everywhere, and when it's not breaking and you have to keep getting new yarn just to finish your project, and it takes up more time. So if you do like to sew with the chenille yarn that you crocheted with, you can use a plastic needle. Just go slowly and be a little bit gentle to make sure it doesn't break. Alright, so here was the other option to sew it together using a different yarn altogether, such as cotton or acrylic. I grabbed the yellow color, even though I feel like you can't see the stitches where you sewed it. Since this chenille yarn is really plush and thick and fluffy, I feel like you couldn't see this cotton yarn. I just chose yellow color just to be safe. But what I liked about it is it was so much faster to sew everything together than having to deal with the yarn that breaks a lot or gets caught a lot. So this is really nice if you're on a time crunch, maybe you're doing a market or making a gift. You should definitely try this out and use an acrylic or cotton yarn. Alright, and then tip number 4 is to choose to crochet a plushie that has little or no face details. This dinosaur is one example, and a lot of dinosaurs are good examples of that, where they don't have a lot of face details. When you're new to crocheting, it could be overwhelming where you finally finish the plushie, but then you gotta do all the little embroideries on the face. Another good option is a turtle. The turtles really just have eyes. Some of them have a little cheek detail, and that's about it. So it's kind of nice because when you're done, you're done. You don't need to add in all the extras. That could be overwhelming, especially if you're a beginner and you haven't crocheted too much. Because when you're a beginner, it's nice when you could finish a project. That way you could see what you want to work on and improve on, and start small, then expand your skills. So pick something with little face details. Maybe not a cat. I feel like cats and bears are notorious for having so many embroideries and details on the face, like the cat with the eyes and the nose and the whiskers and everything. It can be a lot and it can be overwhelming. And a lot of times when you're learning to crochet, you practice more crocheting, and then the embroidery is kind of like a whole different ball game. So just start off something small that maybe just needs safety eyes. Like I said, bears are also notorious for having a lot of details, like the muzzle and the nose and everything. So pick one of the plushies that has little or no face details. That way you can just finish it and not be overwhelmed with all the little extras, and that way you can just kind of focus on your crochet skills. And then once you get better at crocheting, then you could go ahead and focus more on embroidering and those other details. Because it could be disappointing if you spent all your time crocheting only for it to turn out funny because you weren't too good at sewing on all the little eyes and whiskers and everything. Alright, and tip number 5 is try using a chenille yarn instead of a cotton or acrylic yarn. Sometimes it's not you, it's your yarn. And if you're a beginner, that acrylic yarn really shows the stitch definition. So if your stitches aren't the best yet, if you use a chenille yarn, it's fluffier and thicker and it's not as obvious. This is the same pattern, 2 different yarns. One was acrylic, one was the chenille, and one kind of turned out cuter. So definitely switch up your yarn. Sometimes that's all it takes. And like I said, the chenille yarn just makes it fluffier, not as obvious to see if your stitch definition wasn't the best, such as your tension or if there's a few holes. Switch it up. Don't get me wrong, it's really nice to use acrylic yarn, but maybe save that after you improve your skills, because I really do love the stitch definition when you get it right. But until you're there, start with a fluffier yarn where it's not as obvious. And there's some really popular YouTubers that mostly use chenille yarn. But if you go back and look at their older videos where they used acrylic yarn, you could kind of see the mistakes a little bit. You could see it here on mine, the holes and everything, all the gaps in the crocheting. And a lot of those popular YouTubers, they got more popular when they switched their yarn to chenille yarn, because then you couldn't see the mistakes. So give it a try. Alright, and tip number 6 is if you want to adjust the size of a pattern, just use a bigger or smaller yarn. Here, I made this duck with Big Twist Posh. Turned out good size. This second duck here was with the Just Chenille. Turned out smaller because it's a thinner yarn. And I did the same thing here with the pumpkins. You can see the one on the left, the white one is Juicy Couture, which is thicker. The one on the right was just some acrylic yarn by Big Twist. It is thinner, so it turned out smaller. The thicker one turned out bigger. So a lot of times, just switch up the yarn. Don't feel like you need to add extra rows or extra stitches to the pattern. A lot of times, like I said, it's not you, it's the yarn. And an artist is only as good as its tools. So sometimes just switch out the tools you're using. You don't always need to switch the method. And number 7 is our last tip, and that is fluffy yarn makes it really difficult to see the stitches. So even though the plushies turn out really cute, there's a lot of really fun ones that use a fluffy, fuzzy yarn, and they are really unique looking from a lot of the other crochet plushies you see. But while you're crocheting it, that could be difficult not seeing the stitches. Another yarn is black yarn. Almost any black yarn or really dark color, that is also difficult while crocheting to see the stitches. So if you're new, maybe stray away from those. This one, I just used a tiny bit of black yarn for the ears, and I feel like the ears was the longest part because I could barely see what was going on. Even though that's the smallest part of the plushie, it took the longest. Here's another example. This yarn is fluffy and it's a dark blue color. Same thing, I don't see any stitches at all. So if you're new, that could be really hard to get the pattern right if you can't see the stitches. So maybe save that for later. Try it with a yarn where the stitch definition is more precise first, and then go back and try it with a fluffy yarn. Alright, so those were my 7 crochet tips and tricks. I hope this helped you, especially if you're a beginner and you're new to crochet and you want to improve your skills. Comment below if you have any more tips and tricks you want to share, or let me know what project you're working on, and have a good day. Thanks for watching. Bye.